This tonight, and the protests tomorrow, and previous protests, and all the actions all around the world are a response to that request. Now, the repression part of our forum today is very specific, dealing with the 19 people who were attacked by the police and arrested for the crime that is standing outside a chocolate shop that directly supports apartheid and saying, we do not want to leave you to do this without an answer. And that is why they were thrown in jail. And we have one of them here today, who's just one of our speakers. And to finish off, I think, for the struggle for Palestine, we have two very, very, very good speakers, who I'm very proud to be in the same room with, and that is Sylvia Hale and Vivienne Porzsolt. I hope I pronounced that right. So, without any further ado, I think I would like to introduce specifically the first portion of tonight's forum, which is the talk about the flotilla, whatever you want to call it. And our two speakers are Sylvia Hale and Vivienne Porzsolt. Now, a little bit about Sylvia Hale, if you'll bear with me while I look at my nice shiny iPad. Sylvia Hale is a former Marrickville Council member, also a member of the New South Wales Lower House, the Legislative Assembly, I think it's called, but I can't be sure. And she's had a 15-year career in Greens politics at those two levels. On top of that, she's a long-time prominent pro-Palestinian campaigner, and she participated in the Freedom Flotilla, or what was supposed to be the Freedom Flotilla. It didn't get quite far because of Israel. And the Freedom Flytilla, or more officially known, the Welcome to Palestine campaign. Vivienne Porzsolt, I hope I'm doing justice to the name, is a spokesman for Jews against the occupation. She's also a long-time activist who's been campaigning for the rights of Palestinians to have equal rights with the Israelis they live with. And she also campaigned, she was also part of the Welcome to Palestine campaign, and she was a member of the Gaza Freedom March, if you remember that, the march that was supposed to go from Egypt into Gaza. And if you'd all give them both a rousing round of applause.
Okay, well, just to, this audience doesn't need reminding. This audience needs no reminding of, I think, the map of Israel-Palestine, and that tiny stretch of land there with Gaza City marked there is Gaza, which, as we all know, has been under blockade for many years. Now, the purpose of so many actions, the Gaza Freedom March that I was on a couple of years ago, and the various flotillas, and this one, Freedom Flotilla 2, was international activists seeking to break that blockade. And a handful of us got together last July a year ago. We wanted to raise money and organise for an Australian delegation to go on the flotilla. And we struggled a bit to get in touch with the international movement, which is a pretty loose sort of arrangement, and people tend to go their own way. But eventually we were able to form a partnership with the Canadians, the Canada Boat to Gaza, and they and also with them were Belgians and Danes, and we formed a partnership that brought a boat. So now I'll hand over to Sylvia, who will give a bit more background.
Okay. Well, I think these slides speak for themselves. It really just shows very dramatically, and this only takes it up to 2000, in the way in which the territory under the control of Palestinians is just shrinking. And of course, this is only up to 2000. So since that time, there have been even more incursions. Sorry, can we have the next? How I happened to go to the flotilla, join the flotilla when I was asked to participate, was because about, in July of last year, I was able to participate in a delegation, a study tour of the West Bank and Gaza that was organised by AFIDA, the Union ACTU's Welfare and Overseas Aid arm. One of the opportunities we had to visit was a rehabilitation centre in Gaza itself, and it was school holidays while we were there, and so when we went into a room which was full of about 5-year-olds, and really was quite extraordinary because what they were all doing was reading the story of Cinderella and the Prince. But anyway, but on the wall were these paintings, these drawings these kids had done. And I just think they tell you so much about life in Gaza. You know, the blood, the bombs, the tanks, just the extraordinary difficulties, particularly during Operation Cast Lead. And when you bear in mind that during that onslaught by the United Nations, Gaza has no air raid warning system. It has no bomb shelters at all. And so when we were there, we were able to see the effects of that in terms of the destruction. I think 11 out of 30 schools have been destroyed, and 30 of those schools, or the remaining 20-odd, had been very seriously damaged. But it was this sort of thing that convinced me how important it was to participate in the flotilla. Another thing, sorry, Vivienne, is that what occurred to me when I was at Gaza, if you were a 5-year-old, what is your life experience? It is that experience of warfare, of fear, of death, of people being maimed, houses destroyed. It must be catastrophic in terms of the impact on those young children, if that's the entire life experience. But then another time, I had the opportunity, on the same trip, I was in Jerusalem, and I was on a bus that is basically patronised by the Arab community. And, of course, routine. The bus is stopped. 2 or 3 young soldiers get on, demand people show them their identity cards, tell people to get off the bus, interrogate them, and yet they're armed to the teeth, they really are. And again you ask yourself, what is the impact on the young people of Israel who are compelled to undergo military training? And so from the two sides of the coin, you just think there's a community, a whole generation growing up whose view of the world and whose view of the life's possibilities is so distorted by what I believe is the oppression of the Israelis, of the Palestinian community. Sorry. No, that's okay. So
next slide.
Yep. Sorry. This is
Okay, so our Canadian partners bought a boat called Tahrir, and it was kept under great security. We had no idea where it was kept until the very last minute, because in fact the issue of the problem of sabotage was a very real one, and 2 of the boats were sabotaged on the flotilla. And this, we had been asked to join the rest of the Canadians we'd go to Athens and then go to Crete, and then we went by bus to this small tourist town called St. Nicholas, Agios Nikolaos. And this is our boat Tahrir in position. As you can see, it's a tidy little boat. It's for accommodating 50 people, but 50 people on a sort of day excursion, not exactly 50 people overnight. So we were all when we did go on the boat and stayed on it. We were originally in hotels, and then we got on the boat. It was just really cramped conditions, but perfectly manageable. And if you'd like to take these, thank you. Yes. Now these are us 4 delegates from Australia. We've got Michael Coleman, who's a youth activist in Sydney. We have Sylvia, and we have Nick Warwook from Western Australia. He's a doctoral student who is studying the tunnels, bringing the goods into Gaza to overcome the blockade. And then you have me. Okay, thank you. Now, what happened was that even though our boat was completely seaworthy and had been guaranteed and certified and all the rest of it, the authorities in Greece, and not only for our boat, for the half a dozen overall that were parked in different parts of Greece, because we had thought Greece would be a sympathetic country, or the movement had thought that, we were in fact blocked because they'd find something wrong. They'd say, we need this documentation, and then you'll be right. And then they'd say, no, we need that documentation and that documentation. And eventually the Minister of the Interior said, well, there's no boat going to leave Greece for Gaza. And the reason we know for one thing that Papaandreou and Netanyahu have become great buddies. There's also a gas field in Greek waters, I understand, Sylvia, that there is a potential contract happening where the Israelis are going to invest and allow the Greeks to develop that gas field. And of course, with their economic situation, they were extraordinarily vulnerable to pressure. And that's what happened. So this is a demonstration in the streets of St. Nicolaus to protest that. And there's Sandra Rush, who is from the Canadian boat to Gaza, and she had been there in Greece since March. And she bought the boat and she hired the crew and she did a fantastic job. The crew were fantastic. 3 local people from St. Nicolaus. 2 of them had been on previous flotillas and boats. They understood the score. They were really committed politically. And for me personally, I found their experiences gave me sort of grounding in the realities of the kind of experience we were embarking on. Is there something you want to say, Sylvia?
Okay. I was just going to say that, of course, while we were there, this was the period where Greece was under enormous pressure as to whether, in fact, it would adopt the austerity measures that were supposedly going to save its economy. And, of course, it was during that time it was particularly vulnerable to pressure from the Israelis and, of course, the United States. But the thing that we found was the people of St. Nicholas generally were very supportive of the flotilla, and that went to the Coast Guard and people we spoke to. So whilst
the harbour mistress.
Sorry?
Even the harbour mistress.
Yes, the harbour mistress.
Who had to do the government's orders and find all these problems.
So while we were marching through St. Nicholas on 2 or 3 occasions, another part of the town, the people there were rallying against the austerity measures. Okay, so the next slide is really...
Well, we still haven't told about Kenway, have we? You tell about that.
Yes. Sorry. Well, when it became pretty clear that we weren't going to be permitted to leave legally. And so we're in a real dilemma. What should we do? We were staying on the boat full time at that time because other boats had been sabotaged. I think it was the American and the Canadian and the Irish boats had been sabotaged. So we debated, and then we concluded, well, we should make a break for it. But we couldn't use the Greek crew because the ramifications for them, if they were to defy this ministerial order, it was their livelihoods would be at stake. We might all go home, but they were going to be the ones who'd be left there. So it was a question, okay, here we have this sort of mini Sydney Harbour ferry sitting there, but how on earth were we going to get it out? And then, because there were about 40 of us from Australia, Belgium, Denmark, Canada and Denmark, and so we just asked amongst the people what skills they had, and it turned out we had 1 captain, 1 navigator, 2 ship's engineers. 1 engineer had been on a ferry of this side, and another one had actually had experience with the specific sorts of gears this boat had. And it turned out there's this amazing range of capacities. I think the captain, or the one ultimately, who really was the captain, he was actually a former member of the European Parliament who was putting his former skills to good use. But we couldn't, of course, have a captain because that person would be liable to being, detained, etc., etc. So we decided amongst ourselves that if we were asked, as we subsequently all were, who was the captain, well, we were all the captain. I think finally, when they did take a statement from us, they virtually gave up asking us as to whether we had anything to add. So we made the break. And it was a lovely, really incredibly good weather. And I remember just standing at the side of the ship and looking down at Michael Coleman together with a Belgian participant, Soha, and they were down there mucking around in kayaks. And I thought, oh, well, that's one good way to pass the time, because it's pretty boring being on a boat non-stop. And suddenly the engine started, and the two of them just paddled hell for leather right round in front of the Greek Coast Guard. And the peak that was sort of moored very close to where our boat was, basically to stop us leaving. So they paddled round and got in front of it, and while they were delaying the Coast Guard, we actually set off. I think we went about 8 kilometres, but not sufficient to actually break to get into international waters. But I must say they were very apologetic about having to bring us back to port. But of course, what do you do when you get a lot of people who are just sort of they don't want to fight you, but they want to keep on going. So anyway, we came back to port. Michael and Soha and Sandra Rush, whom Vivienne referred to, they were all subsequently charged with obstructing the Coast Guard, and there was and were fined.
Well, they got quite a light sentence. They were 30 days suspended, which was pretty light in terms of what they had expected. So that's an indication of the attitudes outside the political leadership in Greece in relation to that. Now, once we were blocked, we could see that we weren't going to get out of Greece. We, in the Tahrir, we sort of ended our project. And both Sylvia and I had, in fact, booked our return tickets quite late because we thought we didn't know what would happen, how long the Israelis would hold us. We didn't want to lose our whole ticket, so that's what we'd done. So we had this time available. We couldn't even bring forward the bookings because it was high summer and there were even the waiting lists were closed. So we'd heard in the meantime of this Welcome to Palestine campaign, in which the organisation for the Rapprochement between peoples in Bethlehem had invited a whole lot of internationals to come to a festival and celebration in Palestine. And they were not to say, as we normally do when we go to Israel, when we want to enter the West Bank, saying, you want to say I'm a tourist or want to see friends or blah, blah. But the idea was to say up front, we want to visit Palestine. And so there were hundreds embarking on this project. But because the Israelis were able to track some of them who had registered on Facebook and that kind of thing for this campaign, they put it on the airline saying, these people are not going to be admitted to Israel, you'll have to take them off, they'll be deported and you'll have to take them at your expense. So the airlines didn't take them. Nevertheless, there were about 120 odd people that got to Ben Gurion Airport in Israel and near Tel Aviv. And they were detained and deported. But one of those did appeal that deportation, but her hearing wasn't till after ours. So we made our own decision. We hadn't had any arrangements with the people ahead of time, and we just booked to go to Tel Aviv, and we went there, and we arrived a couple of days later. So we weren't with the big mob. We thought we might be stopped in Athens because we had been known to be on the flotilla and so on. But we got to Ben Gurion at 4:30 in the morning. We go up to passport control, and the young woman says to us, "Well, why do you want to go to Israel?" And we say in unison, "We want to go to Palestine." And her jaw drops, and she gets very agitated and picks up the phone and chuck, 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 chuck. And people come and look at our passports. There were about a dozen people looking at our passports, weren't there? And we were taken away to this holding area in the arrival hall, and this was very full, even at 4:30 in the morning, and we called out, "Free Palestine, free Gaza, we want to go to Palestine." And they told us they were detaining us, and so we'd arranged, for the embassy to be informed if we didn't email our people. The consulate came to visit us in the detention centre, and they gave us a list of lawyers, and we were able to access 2 bright, young, eager beaver human rights lawyers who were very keen and very politically aware and wanted to push the envelope of the Israeli system as much as they could. And they said to us, well, you know, we could appeal the deportation, we could, and it would be in court the next day, and it wouldn't take too long, and it wasn't unbearably expensive. And so we decided, well, we'd take that on. We could do it. And against all expectations, we won that case against deportation. We were admitted into Israel. We were allowed to apply to go there, and to apply to go to the West Bank, we had to do that within 24 hours. And if we were declined permission, we had to leave Israel within 24 hours. So in that time, we were able to get up to some interesting things.
But we had an experience of the justice system in both Greece and Israel. And as people, it's a totally different system of justice. It's inquisitorial rather than accusatorial. For example, in Greece, the prosecutor sits beside the magistrate and presumably assists the magistrate, to ascertain the facts. In Israel, we weren't even given the opportunity to speak. It was totally dependent upon our lawyers supplying affidavits. But if you are a person in a foreign legal system and you're in a court, you cannot speak the language, neither Greek nor Hebrew, right, I'll be very quick. You can't speak the language. You don't know the procedure. And you don't know what the outcome is. It must be absolutely frightening. And that was our experience also when we were actually held in detention for about a day and a half, 2 days. We were fortunate, A, because we could afford legal representation, B, the embassy actually did quite a good job by us, and we knew we were going to be out of there in a couple of days. So we could afford to be as stroppy as we like. And so we were. But I mean, if you're a refugee coming to Australia and you find yourself in a similar situation before the Australian courts, unable to have any access to your own embassy, of course, very dependent on whomever legal aid comes up with as a solicitor, if they do come up with one, but totally having no translators or inadequate translators available. It's a deplorable situation. And I think that was probably what struck me most, and probably with Vivienne too, just how terrible a situation it would be for so many people. But as I said, we were fortunate. We had a lot of things going for us, so much so... right, about a minute. So much so is that we were released on the Wednesday. We were able to stay in Jerusalem, and on the Friday was one of the biggest demonstrations in Jerusalem for 20 years. It was probably 2/3 of the participants were Israeli Jews, and it was focused upon the dispossessions and the demolitions that were going on in Sheikh Jarrah, one of the suburbs of Jerusalem. And I think what caused it to be such a big rally at the time was that the preceding Sunday, the Israeli Knesset had passed their quite draconian BDS laws. And so there were a lot of people who turned out to show their protest with that. And so we were very happy to say, because what we wanted to point out was not only was there a very visible and ongoing blockade of Gaza, there is a blockade of Palestine. It's all right if you want to go there as a tourist, but if you want to go there to actually look at the political situation, then it's not all right. That's when you find yourself in detention. And you could ask yourself why, like we were searched, it was clearly two women of our age. What physical threat did we represent to the Israelis? And we weren't a physical threat. The only thing we could do is what we're doing tonight, is we could come back and we could talk about what we saw. And the rest of this presentation really is about what we saw in Israel, but I'm afraid because we had extraordinary, went round looking at the house demolitions, talking to people, seeing people who, because they live in villages that aren't recognised, and they're subject to demolitions, they can't get adequate education, health, social services for themselves or their families. And it's that sort of just being able to talk to people that has such a extraordinary effect.
5 more minutes.
Well,
You want to see what you saw in Israel?
Oh, very good. Okay. The actual march was focused on an independent Palestine in terms of the UN vote, and it was the support of people. And it was the interesting thing about that march is, as you saw, it was all red, black, and white. There was next to no Israeli flag, so there was an absence of that kind of nationalism that I'd come to expect in the peace movement. They had to defensively say, you know, we're loyal to Israel and carry the Israeli flag and call for peace under that rubric. But this was not the case for this demonstration. And the red and white and black banner is the banner of the Sheikh Jarrah movement, which is the movement against the dispossession of Palestinians, the expulsion from their homes in the eastern Jerusalem suburb of Sheikh Jarrah. And that is why that demonstration happened. So I think that's a very interesting phenomenon in itself. And of course there are other things as well happening which we won't have time for in terms of the protest movement in Israel tonight. Now, Sylvia and I stayed in a guest house of a religious order in East Jerusalem, in the suburb of Ras Al Amud. And this is a picture in what is otherwise quite a rundown Palestinian neighbourhood of a Jewish building enclave being built. And this is what's happening all around East Jerusalem, that people, they're moving, they're demolishing Palestinian homes and building Jewish homes for Jews. And you can see that kind of the huge, it's like a prison. It is a prison, but and how that's like an image of Israel in many ways. So, and if we can have the next one, thank you. Oh no, okay, that's fine. So that was just that story. Now, then the next thing we were able to do was go on a day trip with the Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolitions. And this was a study tour of the conditions. Now, this is a place in Lod. Now, Lod is right near the airport. It's one of the towns in Israel that's got a more mixed Jewish Palestinian population. But again, there's pressure in these particular areas to destroy homes of Palestinians and move in Jews. And one thing Jeff Halpert told us, that there are more homes, Palestinian homes, destroyed in Israel proper than in the occupied territories. And for exactly the same reason that Palestinians do not get permits to build their homes, they build them illegally, and when it suits the authorities, they get issued with a demolition order and their home gets demolished. Now, in this area, this is a group of 7 homes of 7 members of the same family. Their homes, at 15 minutes' notice on a pouring, nasty day, were given 15 minutes' notice to get out of their homes, and these were demolished. The people had applied for, to have legal permission to have their houses there. They were told it was an agricultural area and they could not have that permission. But that was not allowed.
It was the wettest day apparently for 5 days, middle of winter, bitterly cold when these were demolished. The kids went off to school, came home, and the houses, they weren't even given the opportunity to remove their goods from it. Because they owned the land, but because it was zoned agricultural, they couldn't get building permits. So after the demolition, they tried to put up some tents and move in some caravans. These were held to be illegal, and were cleared away, and the one of the brothers who was living there was charged with an illegal act, that is trying to build on this site. He went to court, and the court bound him over for the period until the case could be heard. The court said that he was sentenced to house arrest. But of course, house arrest is difficult, and so the court deemed that tent would do for the house in this case. So, can I have the next one? As Vivienne mentioned, this land, the adjoining land there, about 400 or 500 metres away, was also zoned agricultural, but there'd been application by a developer who really wanted to develop a set of blocks of flats for Ukrainian Jewish people who were invited, encouraged to come to Israel, and that went through in a matter of 30 days or so, and the buildings were put up. So it is really so in your face. The discrimination is so obvious and so ever-present on a day-to-day basis.
So the second part of the Echad trip study tour was to go into the Negev desert, where many Bedouin have what they call unrecognised villages, which mean they do not have services. They're not recognised for the purposes of delivering of services, and they spend a lot of effort trying to get those services. And so we visited one of those villages. Now, the picture you saw beforehand is showing a map taken in World War II, an aerial map of the area, because one of the myths is that Bedouin are nomadic. But in actual fact, they have settled areas and they have villages. And that map, in fact, shows those areas from, the World War I aerial maps. So that's the government is trying to talk about tribal identity, whereas the Bedouin themselves are talking about their villages and their lands and the services that should come to those lands.
Because the villages are unrecognised, they don't pay rates. But if you don't pay rates, you're not entitled to services. So the group there in that previous photograph, they must be about the only community that has gone to court to demand that they be allowed to pay rates. But their life is a yo-yo between moves by the Israeli to evict them, to force them on, and their absolute determination to stay there. So they have to fight every inch of the way to get bus services for schools, to get hospitals and whatever. Yeah, sorry. So that was, as Vivienne was saying, there is this myth, this Orientalist myth that the Bedouins are, constantly, they don't have any villages. But talking to one of the people there, he said, why on earth would I want to ride a camel when I've got a four-wheel drive? So that was the you've got the next slide. This is the sort of conditions in which they live. It's incredibly dusty. It's very close to a highway. It's one of the highest incidences of respiratory and lung diseases in Israel, and it's these sorts of conditions.
And there's no roads there. We were going on our bus over just land, no road at all, because the services are not provided.
In fact, we went down a highway on our way out, which had been built over repossessed Palestinian land. There was a challenge against that in the courts. The court said, yes, it's for a national purpose. The land can be repossessed provided the Palestinian communities have access to the road. Well, they said yes, but in actual fact, and we drove past them, there were blockades all along the way to prevent Palestinian villagers actually getting onto the road. So you've got de facto Jewish roads only.
Yes, and so this is with Israel proper, not simply in the occupied territory.
So yes, again, I will yield the floor to Sylvia, who's now going to talk to us about her experience as a Marrickville councillor and the issues surrounding the Marrickville BDS. Yes. Sylvia.
Can you do the first one?
No, this is the first slide.
Or the second side? Right, okay, thank you. We started where we're starting. Look, I was a councillor on Marrickville Council from about 1996 to 2003, I think it was. And then I became a member of the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament rather than lower house. There was an overlapping period. During that time, council is, Marrickville is a fairly, mixed area, inner city. We've got a big Arabic population, big Thai, Cambodian population. Used to be a strongly Australian working class area, but obviously now subject to a lot of gentrification. But the council has been almost consistently Labor dominated for that time, except for the last since the last 3 years when there was a Green, there were 12 councillors, 5 of whom were Greens, 4 were Labor, and there were 3 independents. But for the mayor, for this last 12 months, has been a Greens woman by the name of Fiona Byrne, who also ran as the Greens candidate for Marrickville against Carmel Tebbit, who was the deputy premier and purportedly a stalwart figure of the Labor left. But while I was on council passed a motion determining that council would not deal with companies that dealt with Burma, that profited from their relationships, from their business relationships with Burma. How it did that is that it said, well, look, we tender for any goods. If people do deal with Burma, we will... if they don't deal with Burma, we'll give them an extra 5%, but if they do, they won't get that 5% loading. And it was a system that's worked, it's been there, didn't cause any controversy at all. It just went through and no one's ever raised a single issue about it. But from that time on, Marrickville has also gone out of its way to establish relationships with a number of countries overseas, like Portugal, and but also very much with Bethlehem. Marrickville Council has a sister city relationship with Bethlehem, and there are a number of organisations in the area, such as the Friends of Bethlehem, the Coalition for Justice and Peace in Marrickville, the Marrickville Peace Group, the Friends of Hebron, and there's a multi-faith round table, all of whom have been very, very interested. So once the proposal that was put to Marrickville Council in December of last year, that the council basically institute a similar boycott of goods that were produced in Israel, and also certainly not participating in cultural or educational events which would legitimise the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. That put the cat among the pigeons. I must say that, well, it went through in December, but it wasn't until the following February, the month before the state election, that the proverbial hit the fan. And it was from the shock jocks and the Murdoch press. It was completely unrelenting. The very interesting thing was how, and can I say, it's the council's support for the BDS that many people have attributed the loss by Fiona Byrne of that Marrickville seat in the state election. Of course, I think what they forget is that in the actual election itself, Fiona got the highest vote of any Greens candidate in any state election anywhere in Australia. She got 37.5% of the primary vote. So it was a very significant... She was in fact defeated after preferences were distributed, and where the Liberals had declined to preference the Greens, and we've seen the effect of that in the Victorian state elections, where she was defeated by a matter of, I think it was 600 or 700 votes. So, but what these slides show is just where the meeting, because council had in principle supported the BDS, but then it asked the council officers to prepare a report on how it might be implemented. The council officers certainly didn't do the council any favours whatsoever, because they brought down a report, and don't forget, this is a council that has a long tradition of Labor, domination. They brought down a report that put the absolute worst case scenario, as though the next morning they were going to throw out every computer they had, everything that, but that was, and of course, it was that aspect that was seized upon by the press and the shock jocks about, how absurd it was for the council to even contemplate doing this, and what an extraordinary waste of ratepayers' money. So, but then came the council meeting on the 19th of April, when it was to be determined whether we would, the council would actively implement some of the recommendations of the report. So these are just, look, these slides, we could probably run through them very quickly. They are indicative of the strength of feeling at that meeting itself. Just run through. Right, yep, I'll be there. This is Fiona, actually. She came into that council meeting. It was just so packed. That was the council chambers. They're quite large. And there was an overflow into a second meeting. There were people down the stairs. They just couldn't get in, and a lot of them went home. But she was given a standing ovation when she came in to open the meeting. Sorry, next one. And this is the meeting itself, right? So the myth, there was this perpetuation of this myth that somehow, this was a complete affront to the community. And I really think, when you look at the hundreds of letters that the council received in support, from people such as Desmond Tutu, and right from across the world, but also within Australia. Just keep going. Right, these are all just, right. So there were speakers who were opposed to the council resolution. There were speakers in support. Just keep going. There were, as quite obviously, a small group who were supporting, who were very much opposed to the BDS resolution. The posted there, human rights before elbows politics, is a reference to Anthony Albanese, who is the federal minister for transport. And of course, he had come out with the most virulent attack on council and particularly on the Greens councillors, even though, on the council as a whole, even though not only had the 5 Greens councillors supported it, but the 4 Labor councillors supported it, and 1 independent had supported it. So the only 2 councillors who had opposed the policy initially, back in December, and they'd done it because they didn't really think sister city relationships were any good anyway, so they thought that we shouldn't involve ourselves. This, and as I said before, of course, when it's what was motivating Anthony Albanese was absolutely no concern for principle, but rather to shore up the electoral chances, opportunities of his wife, Carmen Tebbit, who was running against Fiona for the seat. Okay. Sorry, just keep going through them. Right. Yeah, I think it just speaks for itself. But what we did see, what we got throughout that February and more particularly March, was this consistent vilification of the council and of the policy, the misrepresentation of what it was. Just keep going. Right, these Nazism, which again, like down here, you're getting this assertion that if you support the BDS, that you're inherently anti-Semitic, right? Again, and I think it was clearly they even ran. They had a lot of money behind them. They even ran a poll where they sort of one of these push polls purporting to be on the part of the council, asking, do you support council's involvement in support for overseas initiatives such as the BDS? And it wasn't the councillor running it all. It was we believe it was the Zionists who paid for it. But it was a totally unremitting. It was a quite horrible example of the lengths to which people will go rather than to listen to rational argument and act in accordance with notions of human rights and decent principles. Okay, through to next. I think that's it.
Thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak. As it's been said, I'm a member of Jews Against the Occupation Sydney, and we've worked for many years for a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I am active in this issue as a Jew because I cannot abide what Israel does and has done in my name in the name of all Jews. I know many Jews feel deeply threatened by the BDS campaign. It feels like a threat to eliminate Israel for so many Jews. Israel is for many a guarantee of survival, so BDS is seen as a threat to Jewish survival and ipso facto anti-Semitic. But principled opposition to the State of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Boycotts, divestment and sanctions against the State of Israel are not anti-Semitic. BDS is not aimed at Israel or Israelis or Jews as such. It is aimed at the institutions and legal frameworks of the State of Israel until it abides by international law. Now, what is there anti-Israel as such about that? If it abides by international law, that's what the international BDS campaign is about. South Africa, while it adhered to apartheid, was a world pariah. And so Israel is, while it adheres to its discriminatory policies against the Palestinians. Once South Africa rejected apartheid, it was embraced by the nations of the world. And so it will be with Israel when it rejects colonial domination and accepts and lives with the Palestinians on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Now, Jews Against the Occupation, as with the BDS campaign, we don't say one state, two state. That's for the people in the region to deal with. The question is that there should be equality in whatever political solution is established. And Israel is in breach of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in so very many ways. There's torture, collective punishment, transferring settlers to land under occupation, refusal to allow Palestinians placed in the wars of 48 to return and to return to the land of their birth, disproportionate response to attacks, illegal destruction of Palestinian homes, crops and groves, continuing alienation of land and the illegal blockade of Gaza, systematic discrimination in access to land, education and resources within Israel, ongoing military occupation. So that's quite a list. It is fundamentally dishonest to attack opposition to Israel as anti-Semitic. It is intended to silence legitimate criticism. In fact, the Zionist movement has disgracefully appropriated and misused the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust and Jewish persecution in the Christian West generally in what Norman Finkelstein has dubbed the Holocaust industry. It has tried to make Zionism the only proper Jewish response to the Holocaust. But never again must mean never again for all people, not just Jews. It is a vile manipulation of the historic suffering of our people to use it as a justification for the continuing dispossession and oppression of another people, our brothers and sisters, the Palestinians. We better honour the millions murdered by the Nazis by standing by traditional values of justice and universal human rights than selling our souls for a false security. The Zionist propaganda tries to label all substantive criticism of Israel as the so-called new anti-Semitism. This trivialises anti-Semitism and also makes it impossible to challenge the real anti-Semitism that is unfortunately on the increase. This is largely fuelled but not caused by Israel's atrocities against the Palestinians. The solidarity movement with Palestine must challenge all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, wherever it is found. But in the name of challenging anti-Semitism, we are presented with the bizarre spectacle of senior ministers of the Australian Commonwealth government trooping off to drink chocolate at Max Brenner chocolate shops. And why? With the obfuscation and lies we've come used to from the anti-BDS brigade, they tell us that BDS is like the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East that must be protected from the vile aspersions of the Palestinian solidarity movement. The boot is on the other foot. They model the Nazi propaganda supremo Joseph Goebbels in their disgusting lies. And they attack our democratic rights with brutal police attacks on lawful peaceful demonstrations against Max Brenner, on dawn raids on BDS activists, and threats to make calls for boycotts unlawful. This last one mirrors the recent legislation in Israel. And this legislation in Israel has made calls for BDS unlawful, whether within the Green Line of 67 or in the occupied Palestinian territories. And this call has brought out many liberal Zionists in protest. They see the writing on the wall for their much-touted democracy. This legislation, along with many others, is distinctly fascist, and Israeli citizens have expressed their outrage, and the demonstration we showed you that Sylvia and I took part in is part of that. In defiance of the new repressive legislation against boycott, support and action, many have announced their intention to adopt BDS, if only in the occupied Palestinian territories. So the whole thing is so counterproductive. It's the same thing here. The kind of opposition we're getting is building the BDS movement all the way.
May it long continue.
Contrary to their lies, BDS is aimed at the state of Israel and its institutions until it abides by international law. Why should a boycott on such terms be a threat to the existence of Israel? Is it so impossible to envisage a framework for Israel and Jewish self-determination that conforms to international law and human rights? Must Israel be supported regardless of its violations of these universal standards and values? How does this serve Jewish security and well-being in the world, let alone any justice? BDS, let us remind ourselves, has three simple goals: to end the occupation of land occupied in 1967, to right a return of Palestinian refugees, equal rights for Palestinians as citizens of Israel. The pro-Zionist brigade faithfully follow their mentor, Goebbels. Tell a lie big enough and often enough, and they will believe you. We challenge their lies. We do not boycott Max Brenner because it's owned by Jews or Israelis. Why do we boycott Max Brenner? We boycott Max Brenner because it's owned by 100% by the Strauss Group, an Israeli conglomerate, the second largest one in Israel, the second largest food conglomerate in Israel. The Strauss Group proudly boasts it supports the Israeli army, especially the Golani Reconnaissance platoon, notorious for its brutal role in suppression of the Palestinians. We enthused against the occupation challenge these lies. We deny the lie that it's anti-Semitic to oppose Israel for its crimes. We say principled opposition to Israel's oppression and ongoing dispossession of the Palestinians is in the best Jewish traditions. And around the world, more and more Jews are expressing their opposition and organising. Jews Against the Occupation supports the broadly based call from Palestinian civil society for boycotts and divestments and sanctions against Israel until it abides by international law. We call for targeted BDS aimed at all individuals and institutions in Israel and elsewhere which materially or otherwise support the continuing occupation of Palestinian land and the denial of Palestinian human and national rights. It is the only non-violent way to put real pressure on Israel, and it is in the proud tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Criticism of Israel in the name of justice and human rights is much more in line with traditional Jewish ethics and the narrow focus of the chauvinist Zionist movement. Young Jews are increasingly rejecting the propaganda they have been fed in their synagogues and temples. Contrary to the unquestioning attachment to Israel of many of their elders, they are increasingly indifferent to Israel and its role in their lives as Jews. So the writing is on the wall for the Zionist movement and for Israel. Change your ways or be swept away by history. It's not only a Jewish duty to act for human and Palestinian rights, it's a human one. No one must feel silenced in defending Palestinian rights by the accusation of anti-Semitism. It's a vile, dishonest tactic to silence dissent. So we're here today to defend the right to dissent and to act on it, whatever the enemies of free speech may say. So thank you.
Is that okay? Yeah. All right, okay. Well, I actually wanted to begin the presentation tonight with a description by the journalist Robert Fisk of his experience in the Palestinian refugee camp in Shatila in 1982. Now, this is quite a disturbing account of what he saw there, but I wanted to read it out because I actually think it is really important for us all in this room to remember why we come out, why we protest, and hopefully why we're here tonight. And he said, "The eyes of these young men were all open. The youngest was only 12 or 13 years old. They were dressed in jeans and coloured shirts, the material absurdly tight over their flesh now that their bodies had begun to bloat in the heat. They had not been robbed. On one blackened wrist, a Swiss watch recorded the correct time, the second hand still ticking round uselessly, expending the last energies of its dead owner. On the other side of the main road, up a track through the debris, we found the bodies of 5 women and several children. The women were middle-aged and their corpses lay draped over a pile of rubble. One lay on her back, her dress torn open, and the head of a little girl emerging from behind her. The girl had short, dark, curly hair. Her eyes were staring at us, and there was a frown on her face. She was dead." Now, that description is by the journalist, as I said, Robert Fisk, and that is of just one of the refugee camps in which there was a massacre by the fascist Phalange forces in 1982. And despite the fact that those forces were Lebanese, they were fascist Lebanese forces, that massacre, that total degradation of humanity actually took place and was facilitated by the Golani Brigade. Now, the Golani Brigade, as Vivienne pointed out before, is one of the brigades that Max Brenner, the company which we're protesting against tomorrow night, actually unambiguously supports. And rather than condemning that kind of inhumanity, that kind of brutality, and I want to read to you what actually the Max Brenner website, written in Hebrew, they've taken it off in English, but what the Max Brenner website actually says about this Golani Brigade. It says, "Our connection with soldiers goes back as far as the country and even further. We see a mission and need to continue to provide our soldiers with support to enhance their quality of life and service conditions and to sweeten their special moments. We have adopted the Golani Reconnaissance Platoon and the Southern Shalal Shimshon troops from the Vasti platoon with the goal of improving their service conditions and being there at the front to spoil them with our best products." And so you really have to wonder what exactly the special moments are that Max Brenner actually wants to provide to these soldiers when they're in the front line. Was the massacre in Shatila, in Sabra, refugee camps in 1982, was that one of these special moments that they provided support for? Or was it the massacre in 1992, or in 2002 in Jenin, in the refugee camp, when the Golani Brigade again went into this camp, killing over 3,000 people? Or perhaps it was the use of Palestinian children as human shields in the war on Gaza just 3 years ago. Or perhaps it was the massacre which occurred again in Gaza a few years ago, when actually the Golani and Givati brigades were 2 of the brigades where it was proven that they used children as human shields to protect them, to protect these soldiers as they went into the front line. Was it the special moment when the Givati brigade actually went and was proven that they held guns to the head of 2 Palestinian children who were actually carrying white flags of submission and surrender when they tried to move across to go from their school into their home? Or perhaps, if people remember back a few years ago, one of the other sweet moments of the Golani Brigade occurred when actually they made headline news across the world for having the most racist t-shirt in the entirety of the Israeli military, which actually had a picture of an Arab woman in a hijab on it, who was pregnant and had a shot around her, and underneath was written, 1 shot, 2 kills. This is the Golani Brigade, and this is the brigade that we are coming out to protest against tomorrow night. Now, there are numerous more instances which have been reported by the Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International and by the United Nations of absolute human degradation committed by these brigades and by the Israeli military in particular. And I think we need to keep all of that in mind when we come out against Max Brenner. Because defenders of Israeli war crimes try and present Max Brenner as just being an innocent little company. They try and present Max Brenner, the bald man, as being a simple lover of chocolate. A simple man who is actually a fictional character. I don't know if people know. He's a combination of 2 figures. One called, I think it's Oded Brenner, and Max someone else who's actually left the company. But they're a conglomeration of those 2 figures, but they've invented this lovable chocolate maker who, you know, is just out there for peace and to use chocolate as a way of bringing the peoples of the world together. Well, actually, we want to try and rip that lie apart, and that is part of the point of the demonstrations which are happening tomorrow. So in Melbourne, the Students for Palestine and the Campaign Against Israeli Apartheid have been organising demonstrations for over 6 months now against Max Brenner and against another shop called Black Pearl, which provides cosmetics which are basically made from stolen Palestinian land. We've held many creative actions. We've had coloured balloons. As you can see, we've got a little bit creative over here with the bald man dressed in IDF gear, sort of 3/4 size. So we can push them over, hopefully, tomorrow at the demonstration. And actually, over the period of 6 months, we've really built up these demonstrations. And we're hopefully, after tonight, we can actually go home and try and make the demonstration tomorrow as successful as possible. But it has to be said that these protests have not been welcomed with open arms from, the population of Melbourne, really, and Australia in general. We've come up against some, I guess it's sort of a pantheon of racists and conservatives in Australian society. We've been condemned by Andrew Bolt and Gerard Henderson in... I feel loath to say newspapers, and so I'm going to say rags instead. The Australian newspaper, again, has run almost daily articles in the last month, proposing the sort of imminent doom of, Australian society if the Greens, come to power, and, God knows the seas will run with lemonade, and, all work will be socialised. There's been a whole campaign which has been, going on the offensive against boycott, divestment and sanctions in the Australian newspaper. State and federal politicians have engaged in the new sort of concept protest, which is called a drink-in, in a vile, interpretation of the radical civil rights movement and tradition of a sit-in cafes to break down segregation in the south of the United States. They've turned all of that on its head, and what they are doing now, right across the country, is to go into Max Brenner to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday afternoon and to show their love and support for the Israeli state. And the luminaries who have engaged in this new concept protest include Kevin Rudd, Michael Danby in Victoria, feel free to or boo, at any point, John Howard and Paul Howes in Sydney, and Wayne Swan in Brisbane, actually just last weekend came out. And it's really, I think, by the listing of those names, it demonstrates the extent to which supporting Israel absolutely, unambiguously, in all of its war crimes, is a bipartisan policy in Australian society. All of the Liberal Party, pretty much down the line, almost all of the Labor Party, almost down the line, has come out to back Israel. In fact, Julia Gillard got a special mention after the Gaza offensive by the Israeli Foreign Minister when he actually came out and named Julia Gillard as one individual somewhere across the world who, hadn't even made one criticism of the war on Gaza after it had happened. This is our very own Prime Minister who has come out with these kind of statements. In Victoria, the Conservative Premier, Ted Baillieu, yes, again, what's going on? Actually sent his police in, as Vivienne and others mentioned, to forcibly break up one of the demonstrations which we had outside of one of the Max Brenner stores a few months ago. His new riot squad, dressed to the nines in blue and white, arrested 19 of us for having the temerity, for having the guts to actually come out and demonstrate in support of Palestinian rights in Melbourne. And subsequently, as Mohammed mentioned before, for the crazy crime of going within 50 metres of a Max Brenner store, simply standing with a megaphone, God forbid, actually having an amplified voice and speaking out in support of Palestine is a crime now. I was arrested along with 4 others for breaking the bail conditions, the totally undemocratic bail conditions which they had sought to place on us. We had police come to our houses just after dawn to break in. They strip searched us, and then I was held in remand for 15 hours. The magistrate who I was put in front of didn't like the fact that I'd given a speech in which I have to say, I did say that I was defiant of the court. The lawyer tried to say, he didn't mean your court, Your Honour. Tennis court, food court, many other things. But for that, I was given a $10,000 surety for the mere crime of speaking out in support of Palestine and refusing to be intimidated by the Victoria Police, by Ted Baillieu, and, dare I say it, by the magistrate himself. So, thankfully, I will never have to see him again. But I think what was interesting, actually, in one of the court hearings that we had, was the claim that the Victoria Police had made about their meetings which had actually occurred between the heads of Max Brenner in Australia, by representatives of the Israeli government here in Australia, and by the Victoria Police and the owners of Melbourne Central and Queen Victoria buildings here. So there was a very concerted attempt by all of these different forces to crack down on any attempt at dissent and in any attempt to actually come out and speak in support of Palestine. We have had a wonderful response from across the world of people actually coming out in support of us. We've had very prominent figures in the Jewish community, such as Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, coming out and sending us messages of support. We've had other slightly lesser known figures, but who apparently are, reasonably well known amongst funky young things, such as the player in Faithless. I don't know, yeah. Anyone? It's a rap band or something. The rapper Loki, yeah. So we've had quite a lot of backing, as well as pro-Palestinian groups from Canada to inside of Israel. The Israeli opposition, some sections of them have actually come out in support of us, as well as the Palestinian National Committee, the Boycott National Committee, which is the peak body which oversees Palestinian, the BDS campaign has come out in support of us. So, and as other people mentioned, there have actually been, mobilisations, I suppose, in support of us, and the demonstration which is coming out tomorrow night is an attempt to actually continue that process of both defending the right to protest, defending the right to speak out in support of Palestine in Australia, but also, condemning the forces which have come out against us. And I think it is important to note the relationship which has clearly emerged in Australia between the far right, between fascist organisations and members of those organisations, and the Zionist forces in Australia. Well, I have to say, moving on to conclude, I think if we're starting to piss off some of those people, I think we must be doing something right. And I think we've clearly touched a nerve here. The hysteria and the scale of the response is obviously much more than about hot chocolate and defending the bald man. What we're doing is actually challenging those who desperately want to try and find some moral justification for a state that there is absolutely no moral justification for. But perhaps the biggest foe that we have yet to face is this man. People have seen this. This is Captain Israel, who is actually currently in a life and death battle between himself and his rather large biceps and the BDS snake. Now, I don't have all of the comic here, but this is just a recently released comic which details Captain Israel as the person who stands for justice and freedom, backed by American tanks, no doubt, and the vile sort of Palestinian snake, which is called the BDS snake. So hopefully we won't see him at the demonstration tomorrow night. Although, seeing some of the Zionists dressed in that sort of garb might be enjoyable. But I think, all of that and the sort of hysteria which is coming out from the Zionist community across the world with regards to BDS is actually a real indication that, again, I think we're doing something right. Because what we're actually out here to do in coming out and protesting against Max Brenner, in coming out and protesting in support of the Palestinians, is trying to challenge the kind of narrative that Israel has developed for itself, which is as this plucky little nation, which deserves all the support it can get. When in reality, Israel is on the offensive. Israel is one of the biggest military powers in the Middle East, and it is backed by the biggest military power in the world, the United States. And on that basis, it needs to be defied. So we actually want to try and tear that veil of legitimacy from Israel. So just like in the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa in the 1970s, we want to try and build up our forces here today, and we need to remain defiant and determined, no matter which boys in blue we're facing, whether it's Captain Israel or the Victoria Police, because for us, neutrality is not an option. Just like the anti-apartheid activist Desmond Tutu said, if you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. But more than that, we need to act on our convictions, and I really encourage absolutely every single one of you to come out tomorrow night at 5:30 at the State Library to protest against Max Brenner.